conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome, everybody, to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be going through the 2026 Senate race primary. I know it seems early to kind of discuss this, but let's keep in mind that we will start seeing people declaring that they're running here in the next 6 months or so because, as a reminder, here coming up, in about a month here, 2 weeks, about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we are 1 year away from the deadline to file to run. And you'll start to see, as I said, some people declaring to run in summerish time of next year, generally speaking, in order to give them enough runway. And there has actually been a fair amount of news over the last week that I think really matters to this 2026 Senate primary race. And I think it's worth us digging into because, of course, we've had McConnell's fall. We have Barr not getting that House Financial Services chair. That's important. And Damon Thayer gave an exit interview with the Herald Leader, and he said a lot in it. And I do think this race is obviously going to get a lot of attention and conversation by myself and others here in Kentucky. And there's a good reason why. Because, well, frankly, is McConnell going to run again? That's the first kind of question. He hasn't really come out and talked about it, but I think everybody, generally speaking, knows he isn't going to run. He's had a fall. He's had his freezes. This is a 6-year term when it comes to the Senate. So, if he runs again, he'd be like 82 when he would get reelected, I do believe. So that'd put him at 88 years old. I'm sorry, he'd be 83 when he won re-election. So that'd put him at 89 years old. He's already having health questions and health issues and comments. And we've seen recently with Joe Biden, of course, that age has become a factor in the voters' minds as they get really far up there in age. It's become part of the conversation. The other danger here for Mitch McConnell, if he decides to run again, is that there has been, over the past few years, people laying some groundwork in order to go ahead and run for that Senate seat. And they're already planning on striking kind of a counter McConnell, recognizing that people don't like him as a senator type attack line. And so if he stays in and decides to run again, he's got a lot of danger of losing because of, one, his approval ratings within his own state, his age, and now you have formidable opponents eyeing up that seat. Because the other concern, if you want to run for the Senate, you want to run for a seat, if McConnell does get reelected, well, your concern here is that he doesn't make it through his term, and what ends up happening is an internal party choice for who ends up running, or the governor, whoever it is at the time, gets to pick who will fill his seat, which means if you're somebody who wants to run for that seat, your only opportunity to do so may be over the next, to run for Senate in the next decade or two would be to challenge McConnell at this point. So I think that also pushes him out. On top of that, McConnell himself has done a lot of things recently, giving interviews and saying a whole lot of things that certainly wouldn't look well if he's expecting a challenging primary. So I do think McConnell doesn't run. Now, people like Thayer, like I said, he did an exit interview with the Herald Leaders. He's leaving the state Senate. He was asked about the Senate, and he said, well, let's not jump to conclusions or speculate that he's not going to run. He hasn't said it yet. But, of course, I think that's just a way of avoiding the conversation that Thayer doesn't want to have. I think we all know he isn't running again. The dangers for him is too much. And so that now opens up this seat to be an open seat, and this contest will be incredibly important because the last time this particular Senate seat was open was in 1984 when McConnell first won senator. So he's been in there for 40 years now, all right? And not to be dark, but I know I would be 70 if the next person who gets in gets 40 years. And this seat, and McConnell himself, has done a lot to shape KY policy. Generally speaking, on the national level, he's done a lot too, but within the Senate itself, you're still only one vote unless you're able to maneuver yourself into leadership like McConnell was able to. And maybe these individuals who's ever running may have aspirations to do that or the ability to do that, but if you don't fall into that category, being somebody who can maneuver yourself amongst those 100 senators, you still have a lot of influence of what goes on within your state and how that shapes Kentucky policy. I mean, let's not forget that the Republican Party of Kentucky building is called the McConnell building, and it's because he's flowed so much money down. And he's done a lot to help influence Senate races and fund a lot of the Republican Party in Kentucky. That's part of the reason why the Republican Party of Kentucky and many of the elected people in power are so disconnected from where the base of the Republican Party is at now, is because for so long they were kind of serving at the, we'll call them McConnellite type figures. You know, it's not to say McConnell himself is this omnipotent being that's necessarily pulling all these strings, but there's people around McConnell that use his position that are kind of like his lieutenants that are put in place to kind of do certain things within the state to change the state's policy in and of itself. Because when you are a senator, you have the ability to fundraise a whole lot more money because your base of potential donors is a whole lot bigger. Because when you're dealing with state politics, it's really just your fundraising base is those who are affected by policy within the state. But when you're running for the Senate, your fundraising base becomes national because everybody's affected by what the senators vote on, and so that gives you more opportunity to raise more money. And McConnell's used that money that he attracts nationally to flow it down and affect the outcomes in races. Because follow me here, right? In a state house race, $50,000 in a primary, or a state Senate race, $100,000, $200K in a primary, makes a huge difference for who ends up being selected. I mean, for $1 million, you could win the next 5 open Senate seats in the Kentucky State Senate. That would be a huge change depending on what your vision is of politics and the policy you generally pursue there. Also, or you could win, 10, 15 of the next open state house seats. And I say open because obviously taking down sitting incumbents is a little bit more difficult, and incumbents themselves typically can raise a fair amount of money. But if you are somebody like McConnell, you can put your finger on the scales in those open seats and certainly dictate a lot, but you have to have the vision to do so. And that leads me to Rand Paul for a second. Now, I like Rand as a legislator. I do. His votes are fantastic. But if I have one complaint about Rand, it's that he hasn't really had, I guess, the vision of looking down ticket. Take, for example, this last cycle. In 2022, when Rand won re-election this last time, he raised $28 million. But he only needed to spend $23 million. More than enough to spend $1 million or so every 2 years on down ticket primary races. And that's with honestly overspending, because, when you're getting money in from your donors, you are supposed to spend it on your election, make sure you're safe. So you overspend maybe more than you need to. Honestly, there's certain races like, you could look at Comer's race for an example, especially this last session where, he spent a few million, but he could have spent nothing and won re-election. And when we look at Rand, we see much the same thing. I mean, he won his primary with 86.4% of the vote. And in general election, he won with 62% of the vote. So I get it. You got to spend on the door knocking and things like that. But realistically, even if he spent every single dollar, what he would have spent it on, he so clearly could have spared the million or so and gotten heavily involved like McConnell does in challenging. Right now, he challenges sitting people too as well, McConnell's apparatus there. Now, sometimes the invisible Rand hand will protect incumbents or try to tip the scales in open seat contests, but the McConnell people are far more involved on it. So the question becomes, if Rand doesn't step in to fill the void, whoever takes that McConnell seat will do so. So it does end up mattering a lot. So who is the major players, right? Who's going to run for the seat? Well, right now, the general consensus is there's about 4 people that are most likely, some of them almost 100% for sure, running for this office. Now I'll go into what their chances are, what their lanes are, who I think has the best chance and why, as it sits right now. But I'm going to tell you who's not running and why. And first is Comer. Comer's not going to run. I do not believe he will. One reason deals with one of the people who does seem to be winning or not winning, sorry, but running is Kelly Craft. Kelly Craft's a big financial donor with Comer, has a lot of the donor group there. So obviously that kind of cuts Comer off from being able to go ahead and, fundraise quite the same way he would be for a Senate race. The other thing is Comer's dream has always been, and this is kind of well known, to go ahead and run for governor. And Comer can run for governor without having to give up his House seat. So if you're trying to run for governor, or that's kind of your goal, or kind of what you want to do here in, 2-3 years or so, you want to start eyeing that up. Why give up your relevance within the state of your congressional seats and also risk something? I mean, you've got this House Oversight Committee. You're getting a lot of attention there. You get a lot of influence that way too. Why give that up to run for the Senate if you really want to run for governor one day, and you can run for governor and not risk your seat? Certainly something to think about. The other individual who I think will not run will be, that some people may be asking why won't he, would be Ryan Quarles. Quarles ran for governor. He was, of course, spent 8 years as the agricultural commissioner. And one thing for Quarles is he also wants to be governor one day. We know that. Also, he's doesn't really, the general indication conversation has been that Quarles doesn't enjoy D.C. He wants to stay here in Kentucky. He wants to be governor. Of course, he wants to be involved in the state level politics. He wants to be a big fish in a smaller pond. Also, Quarles isn't struggling to stay relevant within state politics right now because he is the president of the Kentucky Community Technical College system, which keeps him involved and in contact with major players throughout the state. He can continue to build kind of that fundraising base and that notoriety, and he's well positioned to do so. So if he does run for governor here in a few years, he has that opportunity. And then there's a third person that some people have talked about, and that is Massey, Thomas Massey, looking at running. And there was some potential he could run. He's obviously had a few shakeups within his personal life with the unfortunate passing of his wife that could maybe lead to him saying, look, take it or leave it. If I'm going to want to leave politics anyways, I might as well run for the Senate. And then if I lose, I lose. But I was going to give up my congressional seat anyways. But the reasons why I think Massey will not run deals with why Massey is a congressman in the first place. And I do not think Massey is a congressman per se because of political power or just trying to pass legislation or anything else. I mean, largely put, we see his votes are, he goes against the grain a lot of times with his votes. A lot of bills he proposes don't pass. They're fantastic for what the bills would do. They should pass, but they don't pass because what Massey does is he uses his title as a congressman in order to, influence policy within the state. And he does get involved in primaries all the time. And that is something a little bit different. In fact, for the more conservative liberty crowd, Thomas Massey's the national person who actually does get involved in the races and will support them if they're good candidates. But on top of that, Massey uses his position as a platform to push out the more libertarian-esque, small government, conservative ideas that he thinks is incredibly important. And right now, if Massey goes out there and says or does something, a lot of times the national news will report on that. And he's able to use his positions within Congress, on committees, and other things in order to make points and shift the culture. If he gives up that congressional seat to run for Senate, he kind of has the same amount of, for lack of a better term, attention that he would get. He's not seeking relevance. He has less political power. But if Massey's not really wielding the political power of a congressman right now, trying to seek more of it, then running for higher office doesn't make much sense. And that's where Massey's a little bit different than most candidates. Generally speaking, when we talk about politicians and we're talking about confrontational politics and we talk about how politicians operate, we'll say that politicians, generally speaking, they run for office in order to win office. They want to be reelected for office, and they want to get elected to higher office. That's what drives politicians. But Massey's a typical politician, so he doesn't fall into one of those three categories. He's running for office because he wants to make a difference. And if he believes he's able to make just as much of a difference as a congressman as he would as a senator, it doesn't make much sense for him to give it up. So who are the four that will run? Well, first, generally accepted is that Daniel Cameron will go ahead and run. And I can see why. It's hard to give up that momentum and that natural name ID that he has now coming off that governor's election. If he waits much longer to run again, let's say he wants to run for governor again in 4 years, don't get me wrong, he'll still be known, his name will be known, but he didn't go on to really do something too prevalent within the state itself. Instead, Cameron has been leading a national organization that pushes for conservative policy change. That has put him in a position, too, where he's able to make more connections nationwide, which, once again, that gives him more opportunity because now if you're going to run for Senate, your fundraising base, the people who care about your election, is now nationwide, not just within the state. And so creating those connections, having that position on this private group here that's nationwide has helped him set up for a Senate race and has kept him in the minds and names and of importance to those who matter nationally. But obviously, locally, he doesn't really have that same kind of connections within the state that he had being Attorney General. And so he's got the momentum off his name ID, but then also he's been establishing these national connections. I think it's pretty clear he's going to run. Then you have Kelly Craft. I mean, she dumped, $14 million or so in that governor's primary. She's now built name ID, and she'll have a different edge here when it comes to the national politics side of things due to her big donor status and the fact she knows a lot of the national donors. And I think that'll help her out more in this statewide election where the money will dry up a little bit more for some of the other candidates because Kelly Craft has a connection with the other donors that would normally get involved in these races, and maybe they stay out of it just out of their friendship with Kelly Craft. She also has a little bit better command of the issues. If there's one thing there's many things you can say negative about any campaign, especially ones that lose, but you can say something negative about any candidates. But one thing negative to say about Kelly Craft when she's running for governor is her understanding of the state level issues was a little bit lacking when it came to somebody like Ryan Quarles or Daniel Cameron, who were statewide elected officials working within the state government. They're a little bit more familiar with the minutia of problems that go on within the state. However, Kelly Craft, being a former ambassador, being on that national stage, former ambassador to the UN as well, more familiar to the national audience, and as I said, that donor class, she's got a better chops of understanding the issues that will come across within the Senate election. She'll do, I think, a better job within debates and other things because she may just naturally know some things about some of the issues. I'm not saying you're going to agree with her viewpoints. I'm just saying she may actually know a thing or more about those issues. Then you have Andy Barr. So he's already been laying some groundwork, like setting up a leadership PAC that has been buying up favors, both locally and nationally. And now, Andy, some news happened with Andy Barr over this past week where he was up for consideration for the chair of the House Financial Services, which is a pretty big committee. And I think if he would have gotten that chairmanship, the amount of political power and notoriety that brings would be where he's pretty happy and he's sustained by going ahead and maintaining that chair. However, because he was passed over, and the reason stated by the steering committee when they kind of made their decision on who would be chairs and not, the reasons they cited was they believed he was going to go ahead and run for the Senate seat. Now, if he had gotten the chair, I don't think he would be running, but since he was passed over, I think he can be more convinced that there is a lane for him to run for the Senate because there'll be some other people out there trying to convince him to run for the Senate because they want to go ahead and run for his congressional seat. Finally, you have Nate Morris. Now, he's out there talking to legislators at the state level. He's making his rounds. He's trying to get some initial support. So clearly, he's gearing up for a run. Now, I'm going to make my case for why, if all four of these run, I do believe Cameron will most likely win right now. But I'm also going to argue against my own claim because so that way, no matter what happens, I look like I'm clairvoyant, amazingly smart, and called it from the beginning. So, but let's talk about why I do initially going into this think this should be a win for Cameron. So he obviously recently won the primary for governor, and that really matters here. First, people like to back a winner, and though he lost a general, he's proven he can win in the primaries. Plus, losing a general doesn't preclude you from winning future primaries anymore. That maybe used to be kind of the rule because the donor class would come together. They would say, look, this person lost last time. We can't back him again. We need somebody else to come in here and win. But we've seen people like Kari Lake and Donald Trump, of course, losing general elections, but coming back and handedly winning primaries. And then you also have the built name ID already going into it. And then there's something to be said about the party apparatus and the idea that when somebody wins a primary, everybody's supposed to get behind them in the general. Because it's really hard if you were involved in the general election for governor. So maybe you worked on the campaign, you fundraised for the campaign, you donated to the campaign, you went around representing the Daniel Cameron campaign in order to drum up supports, and you were a surrogate maybe, or you did some heavy lifting. You talked at your party meetings if you're a state house rep or a state senator or a party chair, and you talked about how we need to support Daniel Cameron. And now, a year, 2 years later, you're trying to say to these same people, oh, you should support somebody else. And while you're free to say that and people will say that they're supporting somebody else, it's really hard to be effective in saying you should vote for this other guy, not the guy I told you to vote for before, not the guy I was stumping for just a year or two ago. I mean, you could say it, but it'll just ring hollow. And now you also have lane concerns here for the other three candidates, Andy Barr, Kelly Craft, and Nate Morris. Now, many of you don't know who Nate Morris is. I'll tell you about him here in a second. But all three, Andy Barr, Kelly Craft, and Nate Morris, are all more prevalent in the central Kentucky political scene, which you're going to end up now splitting up that kind of central Kentucky support. Now, this is where Cameron may start to get some issues here because that leaves Western Kentucky now more open, and I think that'll end up helping Kelly Craft. Then on top of that, Cameron, when we're looking at why we think he will end up winning the primary, he got a lot of support from, of course, the Northern Kentucky, quote-unquote, Liberty support. We saw people like lawyer Chris Weiss, a lot of the House reps up there supporting him, a lot of the more conservative Liberty House reps endorsing and supporting Cameron or voting for Cameron. Funny enough, though, the Northern Kentucky Tea Party leader did end up heavily endorsing Kelly Craft, but I think that kind of may have changed, or at least Kelly Craft, any support she may have gained from that Northern Kentucky was heavily hurt by something she did during these last primaries I'll talk about in a second. But the Liberty support will kind of default, I think, to Cameron because it did during the governor's primary because he was really the only one who heavily courted them as well, unless Rand and Massey start to do some heavy lifting and intervention on behalf of another candidate, which we may see. But without that happening, Cameron, I think, will end up being the default of the Northern Kentucky and the more conservative groups all around the state. Now, factors that could lead to a loss for Daniel Cameron would be that with Quarles not running for the Senate, and I don't believe he will, but you do have Craft running, she may draw more support from Western Kentucky. She's from, of course, Western Kentucky. She did win a few counties in the more Western Kentucky area when she was running for office. The Craft family obviously has business dealings as well out there. The Craft also family has a lot of dealings in Eastern Kentucky with the coal mines and everything else. And if Alan Keck isn't running, you may see her pick up even more from out there. I mean, in most of the Eastern Kentucky counties, Craft came in second, even though she finished third overall. And with what vote that ended up going to Quarles, if it now would go to her, well, she would have won many of the Eastern Kentucky counties. So that helps her out too. So you've got the Western Kentucky where there's not as much competition out there now for Craft with Quarles out. Because remember, Quarles as agriculture commissioner would have had a lot of base out in Western Kentucky, a lot of the farmland out there that now could default over to Kelly Craft, especially if Comer endorses Craft for Senate as he endorsed her in the governor's election. So that could help out Craft. The other factor Potentially, though, working for Cameron here is the split McConnell support between Kraft, Barr, and Cameron. If all that support was focused in one place and for some reason Cameron didn't get any of that support, that could hurt him because, of course, it would hurt his fundraising opportunities. But with Kraft, Barr, and Cameron all running, all of them kind of in that McConnell orbit, all of them favored by different, quote-unquote, we'll call them McConnellites for different reasons, I think that actually will end up helping Cameron. Now, going to how Nate Morris may factor in. Now, it's tough for me to see his lane personally, of his lane to victory. Like I said, he may try to win over the conservative, liberty, Republican support, but without intervention from Rand or Massey on his behalf, it's a hard lift. Now, part of Norris's problem with winning the liberty vote over will be that Cameron will, in fact, that liberty vote over from Cameron, that I think he will end up making some of the same errors that Kraft did and has. And perhaps since running for governor, she's made a few more errors because of the circles that Nate Morris currently runs in. Nate Morris is a businessman. He founded Rubicon and, of course, Norris Industries, which is situated in central Kentucky. According to the internet, he's worth about $300 million. So both Kraft and Morris priorly, they were falling more into the donor class group. They didn't really work with the grassroots, and they haven't established a lot of connections with the grassroots. They may try to now, but when you've worked with more the establishment figures and the people who are currently in office, whether that's through political donations or workings, as, like I said, Kelly Craft had this going into the governor's election that I think hurt her, and Nate Morris will have a lot of the same problems. And the reason why they work more with the establishment now is because priorly their donations to politics weren't, many times it's not their own ideas, it's that there's a few key people that they know well that are in positions of regulating their industry, and then those individuals tell them who to give money to, and they go ahead and do it in order to please those individuals. So that way it's kind of a, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And so because you're working with these more establishment figures, it puts you out of touch with the grassroots, and you end up making some errors. For an example, something that mistake I think Kraft has made since running for governor would have been with Ed Massey. Now, she did this where in the primary in 2024 between T.J. Roberts and Ed Massey, which T.J. Roberts handedly beat Ed Massey, an outcome that everybody pretty much saw coming due to the fact that Ed Massey had lost so badly with so much money before to the person who is currently holding the seat, that's now Senator-elect Steve Rawlings, who at the time was the House rep that beat Ed Massey 2 years ago, beat him handedly with far less money. T.J. Roberts coming in, he was a little bit more even well-known in the area. Same situation where he actually raised more money than Steve Rawlings did. And of course, T.J. Roberts won pretty easily, but for some reason, Kraft got involved in that election in supporting Ed Massey heavily because T.J. Roberts said mean things about her during the governor primary. By mean things, I mean he just posted some things online about, where he disagreed with her, which is his prerogative to do. So Kraft, for personal reasons, I think, got involved with Ed Massey. The problem with backing that Ed Massey plays, if you were looking to run for Senate again, as it seems like she is, run for office again, and in this case the Senate, you alienated some of the support you were getting from Northern Kentucky, such as the Kentucky Tea Party had a little bit of support for her for different reasons. But anyways, you end up alienating them, where now more of those people, I think, end up going to Cameron. And I bring up that mistake because I think Morris will probably make some of the same mistakes. I mean, for an example, I'd heard he was looking to hire like Jake Cox on as a political consultant, which would be, whoever hires Jake Cox might as well give up on getting any conservative support statewide, because Jake Cox was the one who ran this multi-million-dollar, on top of the fact Jake Cox is not very good at consulting, but he ran this PAC that went out to defend three, I think, 3 or 4 maybe, current sitting members of the state house who were more establishment that were being challenged, and then also tried to take out several of the conservative members of the House, and he lost every single one of those races other than one, and he had far more money in every single one of those races, and yet lost, and created a lot of enemies and a lot of people saying, look, we don't particularly like you within the conservative cadre because of some of the attacks too were really unfair, of course, and always any side's going to look at attacks against them as unfair. But for an example, if somebody like Nate Morris was to hire Jake Cox, that would be a big mistake because it would immediately alienate every single conservative group. And if you're trying to court that vote, well, you might as well give up on it now. So I think that if Nate makes those errors, it could be a problem. The other thing with Kraft and Norris both running will be both of them will most likely be very big dollar spenders. Obviously, Kraft's a billionaire. Norris worth $300 million. I don't think it would be extreme at all to say either one of them dump, $10 million into the race. But because this time around, unlike during the governor's primary, there's now two big spenders, I think that will actually make the race easier for someone like Cameron to win because the big spenders will kind of cancel each other out. Then you have Andy Barr, which his lane would be to pick up, I guess by large margins, his congressional district and be more competitive in Louisville. However, this is why I think Barr may not run if he doesn't run, because his lane, I think, is really narrow. And if he does some polling, he may find out that, he won't even win his own congressional district. And he will immediately be discounted by many of the more conservative, even MAGA people. You got to understand, right? If you're viewed as a kind of establishment member and you've said or done or had a lot of votes and you're not the incumbent, and you've said or done or had a lot of votes that you could be attacked for, that immediately kind of pushes you into a margin of maybe around, let's say, 30% or so of the electorate that would even entertain voting for you if you can be castigated that way. And the problem for Andy Barr is that, 5/6 of the state don't vote for him. He's not their congressman. And so when they start rolling out all these votes that he's had that have been bad, of more spending, et cetera, and paint him as a, for lack of a better term, a rhino, it's going to be hard for him to claw himself back from that. And if he leans into it even and kind of leans into like his Ukraine side of things on foreign policy goes, anybody who's for interventionism foreign policy is immediately going to be discounted, I think, by a good chunk of the electorate, because we just saw, obviously where the Republican Party is with their choice of Donald Trump and everything else, and how the isolationism wing kind of is definitely where the Republican Party is going. So much of a worry to some people that individuals like Mitch McConnell have actually wrote recent op-eds and articles trying to dissuade Republicans from being against interventionalism and the America First cadre. And if somebody like Andy Barr is able to be casted as not America First congressman, well, then he would be, like I said, he would be relegated to a much smaller percentage. So that's why I think he may drop. And if he does, I think that gives more opportunity to people like Kraft and Norris, because that central Kentucky vote doesn't get split up as much. Now, Barr may be pushed into running by a group of people, led, for an example, by somebody like outgoing State Senator Thayer, who, in a recent Herald Leader interview article, I think he clearly indicated that he wants to run for that 6th district seat, so he may end up pushing Barr into running for Senate so he can run for that 6th district seat. And honestly, he would probably win that seat too, because there isn't a lot of others who would run for it that could command and be able to pull in the several $1 million it takes to run a congressional primary. Because if Nate Morris is smart, he may run for that congressional seat instead of the Senate seat, but he may see that as too small of potatoes. And you hear me talking a lot about raising money because the fact of the matter is that money matters. If people don't know you're running, they don't know your name, they don't know what you stand for, or what you're pretending to stand for at least, well, then they're not going to vote for you. They're going to vote for somebody else who has the money. People can be upset about the fact that money is such a factor in a lot of these races, at least to a certain point. As anybody who listens to the show knows, I have a policy or a philosophical political belief of saying there's a rate of diminishing returns, that once you hit X amount of money, fundraising much more beyond that, spending much more beyond that doesn't result in anything better. But at the same time, I do think that rate of diminishing return for the statewide offices is very high, like $2, $3, $4 million in a primary. For a congressional race, we're talking $1-2 million at least. And so because that is so high, I do think that it precludes a lot of people that maybe would be good senators or good congressmen from running. Now, here's some X factors, I think, to consider in this Senate race. And that is one of them is you'll have a completely different electorate showing up. You'll have more people showing up, a less informed electorate typically, which means this money factor plays a larger point. And so to illustrate my point here about how big and different this percentage will be, let's look at the past 3 midterm elections and compare that to the past 3 governor primaries, because our most recent fraught primary is that governor's primary. We're going to see, I think, several people who ran in that primary now running for the Senate election. It was kind of a precursor to this. And so I think comparing the two and looking at how that may affect and give you a different outcome. Because obviously Cameron won pretty handily that governor primary, but why is it that with him running, somebody else may win? As I said, I think Cameron has it right now, but in order to make sure that, no matter what happens, I'm right, I'm now making the case for why this may affect Cameron and why you may see a different outcome in this primary. So looking at the voter turnout, when we look at the past 3 midterm elections, we see in 2022, our turnout was 25%. In 2018, our turnout was 24.4% in the primary. 2014, our turnout was 30.3% in the midterm election primaries. Now compare that to the last 3 off-year governor primaries. 2023, our turnout was 19.2. 2019 was 18.3, and 2015 was 17.2. So smaller voter turnout means you have more informed, more involved voters that are less easily bought off. But when you have more voters turning out, that means that they're less engaged. And this is where Kraft and Morris will have an advantage, because these people don't naturally know who these individuals are per se. And it also gives them an opportunity to just make a case to them directly that maybe individuals that have less money won't be able to make. Because when we're talking about 6 to 7% more voter turnout, that's equal to about 100,000 more voters. Let's keep in mind only 300,000 voters showed up in the 2023 governor's primary. So that adds another 33% to the electorate. And Cameron won with 144,000 votes. And now we're throwing in 100,000 more voters. That does make it harder, at least, for someone like Cameron. And this also, I think, does give another edge to Kraft, where if Kraft does have an opportunity to win, this is why. And that's because Kraft has a greater name ID with those voters compared to Nate Morris, because during the Republican governor primary, where she had so much money, she was casting a larger net with her advertising. She was sending mailers to a larger group of people than Cameron was. Cameron was sending mailers out, true, but he was sending mailers out to the higher propensity voters compared to Kraft, where she had so much money. Her opportunity was to send mailers to voters that were less likely to turn out. Now, that group of people that she was sending to are more likely to turn out now in that election, and she will have already built up some name ID with those individuals that maybe somebody like Cameron hasn't already done, or somebody like Nate Morris will not have done. Now, the other big X factor here is going to be obviously Donald Trump. If Trump stays out, and he may, because one, he endorsed Cameron during the last primary, but he lost, is he going to come out and endorse against who he endorsed just a year or two ago? Maybe not. Also, the reason why I think Trump may stay out is because whoever wins this will almost assuredly win the Senate. The Kentucky has been voting Republican for our national Senate now for decades, long before we had a Republican legislator, long before we had an opportunity for Republican governors to win. We have been voting as a state red in federal elections for decades, voting red for governor, for president for a lot longer than we've been voting red at the local level. And we've been voting for senators to be Republican, like I said, for a lot longer than we've even been voting for Republican presidents. So you're pretty sure that whoever wins the primary will end up winning the Senate election, especially if Beshear stays out, because Beshear says he's not going to run for that Senate race. I think that's smart for him because, one, it keeps a loss off his record. It keeps donors where they may still give money to him, and if he's eyeing up running for president with the potential to be a VP candidate in the 2028 presidential elections, then him staying out of the 2026 Senate elections makes a lot of sense. And he also, like I said, he has a higher opportunity of losing that because he's not the incumbent, and it's a different electorate, a different group of voters that show up to vote in general elections there, and Republicans just do better on these federal offices. And so for that reason, I think Beshear's staying out, and if Beshear stays out especially, I think it's pretty much a shoo-in for whoever the Republican will be. I mean, on the Democrat side, you may end up with Cory Booker running again. You may see maybe Amy McGrath take another shot at it. You may see somebody like Rocky Atkins run, which would be probably the smartest person they could run. You may see somebody like Matt Jones decide to go ahead and give up the radio show for a bit and run for the Senate. And somebody like Matt Jones could probably put up a pretty good fight. But I do think, barring somebody like Matt Jones or Beshear deciding to run, whoever wins the primary wins the Senate seat. And so Trump may stay out of it because he's going to have to work with this individual. And if he ends up backing the wrong horse, the wrong pony in the race, well, then he may end up having to work with somebody who, quite frankly, has some animosity towards him due to his behavior in the primary. So he may stay out of it. So if no Trump endorsement comes in, that may result in the default kind of MAGA vote, I guess you'd call it, going to Cameron due to the prior endorsements. So all these factors are things to consider, and they're things for you to look at as you're moving forward and looking at these Senate races, and as you're looking at how people are carving out lanes. How are they going to campaign themselves into that office? I think some of the different lanes and arguments I've laid out need to be playing in your head as you consider why people are doing what they're doing. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be back here probably tomorrow with a new show. Thank you all so much for joining me. Hope you have a great rest of your day.